recording. Welcome to Drupal GovCon 2018. Good morning, this first session. So we are from Mobomo, and we are sponsoring the conference and also presenting this talk. So today's talk is about modern conversations about refactoring redesign. And so we're going to be sharing some of our experiences using agile practices when executing large federal contracts. So I am Shawn MacFarland. I'm the CTO of Mobomo, and I oversee our federal and commercial projects.
I am Jason Schulte. I'm a senior technical director for Mobomo, mostly overseeing federal projects, but do some commercial work too.
So who is Mobomo? We are industry leaders in implementing enterprise-level, large-scale, public-facing, cloud-based Drupal CMS solutions for federal agencies, including NASA, USGS, NOAA Fisheries, the International Trade Association, and Department of Commerce. At each of these agencies, we've successfully navigated refactoring and redesigns, winning the awards that you can see in recent years here. At today's talk, we're going to share some of our practices about these experiences. So the majority of federal projects are funded to support a base year build-out and a launch, followed by 2 to 4 option years of some combination of operations and maintenance and development, modernization, and enhancement services. Agile practices provide continuously available project proof points, both during the initial build-out phase, pre-launch, and for the regular cadence of releases post-launch throughout the project lifecycle. Agile projects make timely decisions based on best available information, guaranteeing a predictable project velocity. Agile projects, by their nature, slant their focus toward new feature development, often at the expense of the underlying technical work that may not be visible to business owners. This bias in execution will often drive an agile project into a wall of technical complexity and debt that may well overcome even an excellent team's ability to successfully deliver client priorities quickly. Long-term sustainable large projects require the agile embrace of refactoring and redesign. Technical debt is the inevitable consequence of prioritizing the delivery timeline of a project schedule. The promise of modern agile development and agile management is to consciously and correctly forecast the nature of that debt. You're welcome to join if you wish. To rigorously monitor the efficiency cost of carrying the debt, and to elegantly schedule improvements in advance of those costs negatively manifesting on the project. In fast-moving agile projects, the crisis point for this debt manifests as a complexity wall that reduces the velocity of development to a crawl and reduces stability and reliability in ways that prevent the rich growth of the software project. Hey, strangers. Welcome. So, what is refactoring and redesign? So refactoring, we're going to invoke the Martin Fowler, description of this, who sort of brought this to the forefront. Refactoring is accomplished by sequences of small behavior-preserving transformations. The system being refactored is validated against a known functional baseline after each transformation, ensuring uninterrupted operation. And so refactoring came to prominence during the rise of Java. In the era of client-server computing, cross-machine, cross-operating system function calls were central to architectural design, and as a result, most applications and services relied on standard C++ code interfaces based on this interface definition language from either a COM or a Corba standard. Java was designed to remedy the ills of this era and found purchase in the enterprise by allowing functional substitution within a distributed application by supporting and replacing interfaces based on units of functionality, endpoint by endpoint. In 2018, refactoring is now a standard agile practice, which must be built into development project plan schedules, costing, and project roadmaps. What's not standard is the conversation with stakeholders to make this possible. So what is redesign? Redesign changes an existing body of code by altering its internal structure to intentionally change its external behavior. Redesign requires a planned series of functional transformations, each of which will require the creation of tests to validate the correctness of the new state of the transformed application components. In 2018, redesign is now a standard agile practice, which is a planned part of the project roadmap and must be continually evaluated by intentionally collected feedback and periodic data collection. The federal requisition process begins many months before a request for a quote or request for a proposal is released to the public for response and selection, which may take additional months. After an award, it may take 1 to 3 months for the selected contractor to get up to speed on the nature of the system and the issues the government would like addressed. It's practically impossible for federal system owners to anticipate the complete range of technical challenges that will be required to meet the business needs of the system for which they are responsible, or to fully understand the knock-on implications of changes to their systems once goals begin to be met. As a result, we've found the most successful federal contracts build in a redesign of key complex system components beyond the initial launch phase on a continual basis for a given contract. By consistently delivering iterative minimum viable products for features and components, the Agile management process anticipates the redesign process in its roadmap, ensuring that projects are not over-designed and limiting waste from unpredicted deadlines. So we focus in redesign on modern architecture. Modern architecture is built upon microservices, permitting the controlled and granular version replacement of functional endpoints. A microservice-based architecture permits the clean and segmented upgrade or replacement of an application's services without affecting the functionality or operations of the application core. This is a much more mature approach than replacing functional endpoints in previous eras. So refactoring or redesigning consideration should all focus on aligning with modern architectural principles. And so we'll reference the summary of 12-factor implementation. So we should focus on using declarative formats for setup automation to minimize time and cost of new developers joining the project, having a clean contract with the underlying operating system, offering maximal portability between execution environments. The design should be suitable for deployment on modern cloud platforms, obviating the need for servers and system administration, and minimize divergence between development and production, enabling continuous deployment for maximum agility. And it should, as a result, the system should be able to scale up without significant changes to tooling, architecture, or development practices. So the goals achieved by a migration to modern architecture should improve the scalability options, both horizontal and vertical. Underlying components should be decoupled and replaced with the advantageous new ones as appropriate. Content and data should be transferred via a version-controlled extract, transport, and load pipeline, and configuration should be bound into software-based version-control deployment frameworks. So in a modern system, rather than focusing on specific endpoints, you can focus on entire subsystems. So we might migrate from a Drupal DB cache to Redis and Memcache. Without breaking the core functionality of the system. We might migrate the file assets from local disk to cloud storage. We might migrate from Varnish to a more formal CDN like Akamai. And so these are now possible without major headache. So why do we refactor, right? So today we'll be presenting 3 common federal contracting scenarios and the conversations around them and how the Agile practices that are available to folks can support that, and we'll be sharing some of our Agile practices. So the common scenarios that we're going to be presenting today are that we have inherited a broken house, which is very common when you take a federal contract. The second one is that a previous group has failed to launch. The third most common scenario is that our client has received a new executive mandate. And so with our practices of Agile discovery, Agile development, and road mapping, we hope to bring these projects closer to nirvana. Of course, that's always a work in progress. So let's talk about the broken house. So you've been gifted a broken house. You're working with or around an inherited implementation which prevents achievement of the technical and/or business goals, right? So what is a broken house, right? What are the symptoms of a broken house? Which is it's fragile to deploy. It may require many undocumented manual steps. The system internal logic is tightly bound together. It is a convoluted implementation that prevents fixes and improvements. An engineer is likely to unknowingly break something in the process of changing system internals. Basic business user needs are not being met. Users cannot update the system content without the support of an engineer. The system cannot be modified to meet new business needs. And it's systematic of proprietary legacy systems. So one of the big problems that causes these kinds of situations in a production project environment is that the production system itself does not have a high level of maturity, and this has made the owners afraid of change. So what kind of fear drives the system owner? So imagine being a system owner, excited continually about new features, desperately hoping to satisfy internal stakeholders and internal users with the latest deployment, and yet the replacement system does not show or perform well in the testing environment. And worse, a series of subsequent deployments, even to the test environment, indicate near random backward steps in functionality. Testing and validation becomes a huge challenge because experience is showing new random unrelated pieces of code suddenly misbehave. God help us if we introduce these new problems to our already less than stellar production system. Modern development practices coupled with modern technology eliminate this fear. So the challenges for the broken house is that the system maturity level is low. There are no automated deployments. Manual steps may be undocumented. Production configuration is unknown or not documented. Lack of the stage environment or parity of stage with production exists, and there's no way to test deployment processes or system changes. Issues may remain undiscovered until production deployments occur. Communications with a client about technical debt should focus on how did we get here? How do we prevent this from happening in the future? Undiscovered technical debt may constantly be occurring. Unforeseen bugs may become exposed through this refactoring process, and some components may require reverse engineering. So how do we have this conversation about the reality? So broken house conversation is discussion about performance data. The goal of the broken house conversation is to convey the quantifiable maturity level of the system and the technical remediations, process improvements, and timelines for the transition necessary to mature it from its current state, right? The first step is to identify key business performance indicators. How effectively does the system actually support the business process? How long does it take for a feature to go from dev to test to production? How many deployment issues occur in a given operations window? What does user satisfaction look like? How long does it take an internal user to log in and use the system? How many steps are required for internal users to do daily business? How much time do each of these steps take? And indicators to identify a system maturity level are the creation of automated deployment and build processes. By doing this, you are guaranteeing to create a reproducible state in each of the tiers of the environment. This focus on automated deployment and build allows one to prove the reproducibility of the environments and their deployments using version control. Business metrics, these kinds of business metrics imply meaningful and provable targets for the refactoring and redesign work. These metrics can tie directly back to the goals of the systems and its supporting business practice. So as you're assessing a system for its maturity, from a higher level of maturity to lower levels of maturity, an application may not be reproducible. Right? So the first step is to determine that the system and its environment is baselineable in a reproducible way. Without reproducibility of the environment and its components, we cannot compare the difference in measurement of the system before and after improvements. Additionally, the application may not actually reflect business needs. We need to identify and extract the data that represents or is the result of the business processes the system is designed to support. Many broken systems have gotten lost in technical challenges and fail to represent their business processes adequately. And then finally, at the lowest level of maturity, the client may not understand the business that they're in. Does the organization understand the hows and whys of their own business value? As an example, one may have been commissioned to build a mobile application to enable a specific audience to communicate with itself. But the organizational goal is to actually raise money for the organization itself in support of the audience. So one way to achieve that goal is to use the mobile platform to enable groups that will contribute money to the organization to market to that audience. In other words, provide access to this captured market. Yet the client may not actually understand that this is a goal that's achievable or that they should be approaching this. So when we're creating these indicators, factors that are used in the composition are things like page load time, responsiveness under load, ease of use for specific personas, code-based deployment processes, call stack time across tiers, data store or query performance, profiling of the specific complex pages, and manual and automated test coverage. So our next scenario is the previous group's failure to launch. So completing and deploying to production a project that one or more previous groups have failed to launch. So you have essentially an unfinished house. A large organization, public-facing website replacement project was not accepted by the client for reasons. What this really means is the development process failed. Owners need help identifying and remediating what's broken in the development process. So what kind of failures are we talking about? Let's again return to the system owner persona. The development team seems to be listening to the requirements of the project. Clever developers seem to be working on problems related to these requirements. However, the problems being addressed don't seem to translate into meaningful work relative to the actual business needs. For the items that seem to be related to the actual business needs, it's not clear how internal users are to use these features. Basic testing of these pieces of functionality, which stray casually from a very exacting sequence of steps of usage, seem to yield obvious bugs. Why aren't these bugs being caught? When the actual internal user group tries to use the new system, they're unhappy and they cannot accomplish tasks that they normally need to execute. Modern development processes ensure what is asked for is what is delivered. So let's talk about the characteristics of a launch failure. So unreliable external system dependencies and connections are a huge source of problems. The architecture may not solve the relevant business problems. They may have re-implemented customly re-implemented community modules that work extremely well. There may be overly complex business requirements. There may be poorly understood business logic which is modeled badly. The deployment process may be unreproducible. Unexpected late requirements and requests may jeopardize project launch. Environmental gateways and approvals are unobtainable within the organization. Multiple teams are working together without orchestration. So a goal for this conversation of the unfinished house is to identify the flaws in the development environment. So this is going to focus on a discussion about user stories and acceptance testing, right? So we want to ensure that an agile development process is implemented. So we have to make sure that the project schedule reflects the needs of the logical dependencies of the system. We have to establish milestone planning with basic prototypes for complex components. We have to ensure individual sprints within a milestone have corresponding tests for each feature. And we need to get approval for the feature test before the feature is developed. And approved tests become a basis for both user acceptance tests and end user training manuals. Building out and verifying the software development and test processes are key deliverables as the result of this conversation. So the basis is to establish a clear source control strategy, development and testing deployment processes. Tools like Ansible for host deployment and specialization, as well as tools like Jenkins and Travis, should be used for code deployment practices. Modern infrastructure as code is an essential practice. If there are still manual steps in the development process pipeline, the team is setting itself up for failure. Components that compose development indicators, a map of business requirements to user stories, a method of validating complex user stories with a client and developer, radically reducing the complexity of requirements for MVP features and epics, understanding data source meaning, separating business logic from data, writing up a press release describing complex key features and how they'll be received. User stories, outcomes, drive test development. So the next conversation is the executive mandate. So often the executive mandate defines the direction of the project. It will establish perhaps a new roadmap after contract award. So currently the theme of focus switches from administration to administration. The current administration is really focused on lowering cost of ownership, which could involve consolidation, retirement of older system services and licenses, data center consolidation, which piggybacks on the existing cloud migration push. And the systems could change scope or system business domain, replacing internal functionality with external systems and services. In the previous administration, goals were more about measurable increase in public touch points for personas, which would lead to mobile user experience and responsive redesign. So what kinds of challenges do we have in helping partners execute these mandates? The system may be bound by previous organizational technological decisions. There may be delayed federal approval for use of innovative technologies. The client's internal partners may be resistant or unreliable. Other client organization members may be afraid of loss from the changes. The mandate decision dramatically complicates business goals. Perhaps core business technical problems block addressing the mandate, or in the worst case, security authorizations are evasive for deployment. So, the roadmap conversation involves building the future together. Right. So this is very important to include the entire team in the roadmap discussion. Engineers will always be focused on utilizing new architectures and technologies. Test engineers will suggest system usage innovations. Business analysts will provide both cost savings and market expanding ideas. Using metrics will direct feature enhancement and feature removals. And surveys and search engine results will highlight discovery gaps. Developing client strategies to address the future needs, one of the techniques for doing this is to determine a power map of stakeholders affected by the mandate. To find and rank internal partners by interest, finding the eager ones for pilot work, for the new designs and the new offerings. Identifying how mandates will improve troubled business operation areas points in the direction of which internal units need help most. And of course, you must over-delivery for early internal clients to ensure a growing network of mandate champions. So, for example, what reasons do we have to go from Solar to Elasticsearch? Perhaps we have a business mandate to display associated articles with the current article that's being displayed in the CMS. So by moving from Solar to Elasticsearch, we can improve the results more easily. We can ensure that that the modular features of Elasticsearch are now available to the CMS. So what are Mobomo's practices? Right? It starts with Agile Discovery. Is your system serving your business process effectively, and can data prove it? So this involves knowledge of system maturity indicators. What types of users use your system? What are their most frequent activities? Why are they using your system for these purposes? What are the goals of these users? Can we deploy and update the system with confidence? Do we know all the dependencies of custom code, of application framework code, of the host, its configuration and environment? How long does it take to get a change from dev to QA to prod? Using this period of discovery normally occurring during the broken house conversation to establish a rigorous baseline of everything in and around the system. Normally many of these things would be required for an authorization to operate and may be found in a document package for that. It may be that the documentation exists as an internal approval under a direct umbrella, or that the documents may not be complete or up to date. So the discovery may involve identifying specific folks responsible for this information, extracting this information from them as best as they understand how to convey it. Once gaps are identified, we have to ensure that a project management plan allows for time to reconstruct or amend existing items with a timeline that coordinates with related technical activities. Absolutely record items that do not exist, are incorrect, or are not provided as items in a risk registry, along with the impact the lack of knowledge will cause project delivery. So our second practice is the practice of agile development. And this is proving consistent delivery. And we need to demonstrate, and we do demonstrate, a development process maturity, right? And this starts by mapping the technical requirements of the project plan milestones and drilling into the areas that are unknown or undefined within those requirements, defining desired outcomes of these unknown areas of research, and boxing the research time for both technical and subject matter areas. Often in development, there are serious gaps, and only through time boxing and determining the desired outcome can we resolve these in a satisfactory way. Establishing a standard sprint cadence leading to client touchable deployments at every sprint cycle. A sprint cycle needs to include a bucket for testing results. The sprint cycle should focus on alternately between development and testing support. And the sprint task descoping should be signaled during the internal testing phase of a sprint cycle. A user acceptance testing period should always be followed by a buffer period before deployment. The testing schedule defines the sprint cycle. Test plans should be developed in parallel to task ticket implementation. Test plans should ensure the synchronization of client and developer understanding. Clients should accept test plans as validating task requirements. A typical Mobomo cadence is divided into two-week sprints. The first sprint focuses on development for the coming release, the test plan, and the internal testing. The second sprint focuses on test results, test result response, longer-term development, and user acceptance. Sprint planning occurs prior to the first sprint and serves to identify the tasks that will be deployed at the end of the second sprint. The first sprint is executed as a selection of development tasks to the engineering team. A test engineer will be creating a test plan for each task and in the process resolving gaps in understanding between developers and business owners. The test engineer will always lag the development team in validating development tasks as the sprint cycle is continuing. The results of the first sprint cycle, having been continuously built into staging and test environments, is now turned over to the client testing team for the first half of the second sprint. The client testing team can now follow the test plan for each task, completing the validation of available internally tested tasks or rejecting tasks for a cyclic iteration during this phase. The UAT period of the second sprint serves as a catch-up time for the test engineer to conclude internal tests as well as a buffer to remediate user-accepted test discovery issues. The buffer week in the second half of the second sprint before launch or deployment allows for iterations needed to close gaps in a deployment set and to de-scope unusually subtle problems without jeopardizing the release. It permits the segmenting of problems from the current set of features in the release. During the second sprint, the development team can work on longer-term, more complicated tasks for this milestone, which in a healthy sprint cycle should be the majority of time. So then we also have to work on the risk management of the process of development and operations. And so the first step is to create a risk registry, which establishes a living group memory for all stakeholders. And this ensures that no problem gets ignored during the software development lifecycle. So the goal of a risk registry is to document all nightmares from all stakeholders, to establish the impact and consequence value for the impact and likelihood value for each of these risk items from 1 to 10. Establish a notional remediation, and then lock the results in stone after review in order that you may establish a history with the group. Evaluating the risk registry internally and with all partner groups weekly ensures that every problem remains in the forefront of the entire group. The goal behind this process is to keep things constantly in view. So urgency of a particular item can be increased with its likelihood of impact as the calendar moves forward. As remediations are implemented, the likelihood can be slowly lowered. And as scope changes may reduce scope to make deadlines, items' impact can be reduced. This history of group decisions provide a project intelligence that is often lacking in most development processes. Finally, getting approval to launch often is a very complicated process. And so for this one, FedRAMP is your friend, really. So what you want to be doing during development is thinking through the operational consequences of the decisions you make in implementation of your system. So during the development cycle, conversations with the ISSO SOC should begin immediately. Often you want to start with a known baseline for your project type, regardless of which agency you're approaching, and then the focus of the conversation is to harmonize policies and plans with existing agency practices. You want to determine together what the authorization package is going to look like, and you want to rigorously test the boundary controls well before you get to production deployment. You want to ensure that the authorization document is auditable and that you've established written roles and responsibilities for all stakeholders. So in following years, the security team can invoke the project manager, the content manager, the webmaster to supply evidence of ongoing practices to ensure that you remain within compliance. All right, so after you've launched, what's the next focus, right? Running a healthy project and continual growth, right? So we want to focus on measurements for the system stability, and this increases the details of the development process conversation. We want to look at regression testing, visual regression testing of key areas. We want to make sure the baseline and system functionality is demonstratively matched across all system changes. We want to make sure that access control workflows are understood, and we want to make sure that the end user workflow are available to them and understood. End users may need retraining as the system changes, and we want to make sure that through this training and through our internal processes, we're validating these existing requirements are being met. Again, there's also system performance metrics that we've touched on before, and so an example is that the client would like to focus on SEO results, right? And so we present the proven strategies for this with the steps to execute, and we want to make sure that the client is willing to take those steps. So if, for example, your website is the authoritative source of sea turtles, and those sea turtles are not coming up under a Google search, then you have to sort of follow Google's rules in order to establish priority within Google. And this will involve updating Wikipedia articles or non-authoritative sources to point back to your source. Now, this may upset people inside your organization who have scientific priorities. So when given a task like this, if the client is unwilling to change, then you have to make a decision as to whether it's worth taking their money to attempt to improve the situation when the conditions for success are not reasonable. All right, so we're going to switch over to case studies, and Jason will walk us through several case studies. And thank you very much, Jason. These are abstracted away from our actual clients.
Yeah.
So we don't want to.
Thanks, Shawn.
Thank you very much, Jason.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm going to talk about some actual lessons learned and projects that Mobomo's been through. I've been with Mobomo a little over 4 years now, so these are all actual projects that I've worked on. I'm not going to mention agency names, but I'm going to kind of go through the details of what we went through, what were the factors and the circumstances of each situation. So this first case study starts out with a federal agency that's just awarded its first large cloud migration contract, and so over the course of 2.5 years, they migrated to the cloud, redesigned and migrated from a proprietary CMS to Drupal, redesigned the whole thing to headless, and all while adding features and enhancements along the way. So a lot of stuff. So kind of to start out with phase one, they were on a proprietary CMS, and it was hosted by the company that built the CMS. So they now are moving to the cloud. Since the CMS is proprietary and it's hosted, they can't pick it up. They can't do a lift and shift. The vendor owns it. Vendor won't sell it, so they have to move to a new CMS. They choose Drupal. So because of issues with the way the contract was awarded and when it got awarded and delays, there was a very tight timeline to get everything moved, 13 weeks to pick up this site and migrate it from a proprietary CMS to Drupal. So very challenging, a lot of long nights, a lot of really fast sprints. It got done. Some things had to be de-scoped, but an MVP was successfully launched in the cloud. And they were immediately able to save money by getting off of the proprietary CMS. Dramatically, improved publish times to push out new pages, new content, things like that. So a lot of great improvements. But then, because of the speed with which it was migrated and launched, we immediately had to go right into new feature development, start, tackling that backlog that we, created from the initial migration. So as we're tackling the backlog, after that 13 weeks to get it launched, we probably have about another 6 months, 9 months of that, and then we start talking about redesign. So when they migrated the site off the proprietary CMS, got a small facelift in terms of colors, but it was basically the same look, feel, same UI. So Obviously couldn't include a redesign in the initial migration, so we started talking about that after we got them in the cloud. The redesign was, pretty extensive. We went from, basically your classic, Drupal theme, it's Drupal 7, and eliminated the theme and went headless Drupal. So, that was kind of good because there was some technical debt that had been built up from the initial migration, and moving to headless meant we got to eliminate all the theme code, because we're rebuilding that part of it from scratch. All the back-end stuff, though, that we'd written for as far as custom modules for new features and things, that stuff was still there. So we go through the redesign, just like any project. We've got some scope creep that we have to deal with, which ends up adding more technical debt because you try things, you go away from them, you don't always clean up your code the best, just, standard project stuff. And, continuing to develop new features and enhancements before, during, and after the redesign launch. So that's the point at which velocity really kind of started to slow down, and it was only a matter of time before we hit that complexity wall that Shawn talked about. Like, we're doing releases and introducing as many features as we're creating, and having testing issues, and so very difficult conversation, but we know how we've got here. If we look back over the last 2.5 years, we have the conversation. We need to put a halt on creating new features. We need to refactor this thing, build in some automated testing, get our production environment in parity with our staging environment, be able to recreate our staging environment through automated scripts so that we can then start doing full blue-green deployments. And so we did that. We had the conversation. We got 6 months to do it. We built up a lot of automated tests. We do full blue-green deployments now, and it's automated, and it's fantastic. The system maturity level went up dramatically, and the refactoring really paid off. All right. So next case study. So this is kind of the unfinished house example. Again, it's a federal agency that wanted to migrate away from a legacy CMS. They owned and had control over it, but they it didn't have the features or quite the ability to be modified and extended like Drupal does. So they wanted to migrate from their legacy CMS to Drupal, and had started the project a couple of years before even coming into contact with Mobomo. Unfortunately, the vendors that they tried to accomplish this with the first attempt were unable to get a fully functioning Drupal site, therefore unable to get it fully launched into production. So when we came in, it was right around the end of the second attempt, and they had a Drupal site, had a development environment, but weren't really in any position to think about launching it into production for lots of various reasons. So kind of the first thing we had to do was do an assessment of where are the gaps, why are we not able to get this thing launched. Can we take work that's there and salvage it maybe? So in doing that, we kind of noticed just a number of different things, not following agile development best practices was a real struggle for the team, as far as managing scope creep and just do, some basic stuff like sprints and sprint planning, things like that. Also, a lot of time was being spent writing code that, for custom modules that was already out there in the community, things that, duplicating work that really didn't need to be done. Anytime you have a project that fails to get into production, there's lots of reasons, and I don't want to oversimplify it. It's easy in hindsight to say, oh, it was this and it was this, but I know there are a lot more than just what I've put on this slide. But in any event, we were tasked with assess what can be salvaged and figure out how to get this thing across the finish line. So by the time we come in, the project is overdue, and we want to see how quickly we can get it across the finish line. You know, our client says, you know, we need it out in 3 months, and it's already late. So, you know, we're looking to see what can be salvaged. Unfortunately, there was not much from the previous vendor that we could reuse. What we did required a lot of refactoring, a lot of rework. So in order to get it out there, we did actually have to push 3 months past when the client wanted, and we had to have some difficult conversations about de-scoping, you know, some of the stuff that they wanted and filling up that backlog. But ultimately, we were able to get it launched, you know, with refactoring some of that old code and doing new stuff on our own. And yeah, it was a successful launch, you know, 6 months after we got in there, and then again, right away into the backlog to go from an MVP that we launched into what they really wanted and were trying to achieve. Okay, and the last case study. So this one is kind of touches on the executive mandate. So it's another federal agency with an e-commerce site, and the mandate from the agency is thou shalt move to the cloud. They have a cloud contract and want to pick up this e-commerce site and move it. So initially we were engaged to do an assessment of this site and, you know, what's the feasibility of moving it to the cloud. So we went in and, you know, start looking at the site, interviewing users. Right away we realized, you know, this site is tightly coupled with an ERP system. It was an ERP system that had a add-on module for an e-commerce site, basically, you know, one of those. So it's tightly coupled. That's like kind of the first challenge. In addition to that, with the ERP system, there was an integrated search engine. That integrated search engine was, you can't, completely closed off to any external applications. It has no API, no way to talk to it. So that's another obstacle we have. And then as we're doing our assessment, you know, just on the application itself, come to find out the agency's contract for the cloud could not support the security requirements of an e-commerce site. So despite that, we still had plenty of work to do. We got to decouple the site from the ERP system so that we can rebuild it in Drupal. We've got to come up with a way to replace this proprietary search engine. And we have a lot with that decoupling. We've got to figure out how to integrate Drupal with this ERP system, you know, because there was nothing out there, no community modules that had been done. I can't mention the ERP system. It was SAP, if anybody's ever dealt with SAP. So we ended up choosing Elasticsearch for the replacement of the search engine. We found a partner to help us with the SAP integration. You know, more or less wrote us a REST API with about, I don't know, 10 or 12 function calls so we can retrieve product information, customer information, create new customers, submit orders, all the stuff that you need for an e-commerce site. Wrote custom integration hooks into Drupal e-commerce. Wrote an ingestion process to get all the product information out of SAP into Elasticsearch, and then integrate Drupal with Elasticsearch to power all of our search functionality. And then about 9 months after we launched the site, we ended up launching it in the agency's data center, and we took the time to like automate our deployments, knowing that eventually we're going to move this thing to the cloud. So let's try to, you know, keep everything as portable as possible. So 9 months later, we get word that the cloud contract can now support the security requirements for the e-commerce site. So we're able to take our automated deployment stuff and pretty much pick it up and move it like you know, really easily. But we went ahead and took the opportunity at that point to refactor a couple of things, which was, you know, in the government data center, all the Drupal file assets were stored on local disk. But now that we're going into AWS, we should move them to S3, so we don't have to maintain a Gluster, you know, file system, and, you know, move the database into RDS, so we don't have to manage our own database servers. You know, kind of the common stuff. And since, you know, everything was real easy to move in the first place, then, and it was all, you know, broken up like modern architecture, it was real easy to make those changes. And then also, since we going to the cloud and we have access to, you know, AWS services like CloudFormation, we take our automated deployment a step further into a full